Historical memory, the nature of it. Short answer, it's tricky, indispensable, fascinating, and ever vulnerable to hijack. The trickiness of memory has to be acknowledged from the outset, as has its fragility. In his fascinating study, The Human Touch, the great Michael Frayn describes human memory as fickle as water. As human beings, Frayn explains, and I'm quoting him now, we aspire to fix the flux of experience itself, to solidify the endlessly evanescent present into a graspable past, by recording it in our diaries, by shaping it into the stories we tell about it, and the memories we run and rerun in our heads by capturing it in snapshots, on film and videotape. But the myths and the memories take shape by acquiring an internal structure of their own, whose relationship to the events they are supposed to immortalize vanishes as surely as the events themselves. Now, I have to say, although I would say quite so to much of that, I wouldn't go as far as Michael Frayn in that last sentence, perhaps because it's a tad too demoralizing to contemplate, given that I've devoted the bulk of my professional working life to one or other aspect of historical memory, and would do so again, were I starting out as a young man and fortune shone on me once more, as it has the first time round. This good fortune has enabled me to pursue my pleasure, almost my passion, as a trade, and as a way of gazing at life almost as if I were with the great Max Beerbohm, when he mused, if one could only look upon the present as an advanced copy of the past. But it's not Max Beerbohm with whom I would wish to open this evening. It's another star of 20th century letters who took the biographical genre of stored memory to new heights. Lytton Strachey. Anyone who's read his 1921 Life of Queen Victoria remains captivated by its last passages as the old monarch is about to set off to meet her maker in January 1901. The vast majority of her subjects, Strachey wrote, had never known a time when Queen Victoria had not been reigning over them. True of our own Queen, actually. She had, Strachey continued, become an indissoluble part of their whole scheme of things. She herself, as she lay blind and silent, seemed to those who watched her to be divested of all thinking, to have glided already unawares into oblivion. Yet perhaps in the secret chambers of her consciousness, that's the phrase, in the secret chambers of her consciousness, she had her thoughts too. Perhaps her fading mind called up once more the shadows of the past to float before it, and retraced for the last time the vanished visions of that long history, passing back and back through the cloud of years to older and even older memories. To the spring woods at Osborne, so full of primroses for Lord Beaconsfield, to Lord Palmerston's queer clothes and high demeanour and Albert's face under the green lamp. It's wonderful and marvellous stuff, wonderful evocation, but dangerous. For today's biographer, this is heady but naughty stuff. We're not meant to peer imaginatively, we contemporary historians, or any historians of any period, into the secret chambers of other people's consciousnesses, as if we were so many neuroscientists investigating our subjects' hippocampi, where the long-term memories are stored, or the claustrum, the bit of the brain where it's thought all the wires converge, making it the seat of consciousness. Though I gather from my scientific friends, all that's terribly mysterious still. But we mustn't pretend that we can do that. We need evidence, papers, diaries, recordings, oral and visual. Historians nowadays strive mightily to think, write and behave in ways that refute Voltaire's famous accusation that a historian is a chatterbox who plays tricks upon the dead. Strachey's glorious speculative intrusion into what remained of the old Queen's mind ranks with those other two far from venial historian sins. One is counterfactual, the what-if history. What if we hadn't gone to war in 1939? What if Labour hadn't won in 1945? The counterfactuals are endless, great, very tempting, but naughty. The other thing that we must not succumb to, though I do all the time, is prediction, forecasting, soothsaying, or the promulgation, in extreme cases, of iron laws of history. Our guide here is John Buchan of the 39 Steps fame, in his memoir, which I always misremember the title. I keep remembering to shut that door, but it's Larry Grayson, actually, who is not quite comparable to John Buchan. I think it's memory hold the door. In 1940, he wrote this. In the cycle in which we travel, we can only see a fraction of the curve. That's the key, I think, to the historian's task, making as much sense as accurately as possible of the curve we have travelled so far. Contemporary historians, like journalists, live on the very edge of the curve already followed and the curve to come. And one of the pleasures of being invited to deliver this evening's lecture is that it made me revisit, with the uses of memory particularly in mind, my early professional years as a young journalist on the Times from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. Long ago and far away, when the first language of the readership was Latin, which gives you some idea of how old I am. This made me think just how much helping to produce a national daily newspaper towards the top end of the quality market was a memory-creating, memory-shaping business. In fact, I used to think that the Times in those days was providing what Philip Graham said he wished the magazine Newsweek to produce when he bought it in 1961. That is, in Graham's words, the first rough draft of history. And all done against the clock in time for the first edition. And the sequence of production flowed something like this. As a journalist, you start off with an existing map in your own mind, a cartography of memory, of history, and how institutions and those who people them behave. Against this cumulative backcloth, you set a breaking story or judge the novelty of a development or an event. It's like in the intelligence world, you have to look for what is abnormal. You have to know what steady state is. And that's essentially what journalists do. In those days, you had a huge cuttings library at the Times on which to draw. In the digital age, of course, it now looks puny, but in its time, it was a fabulous and well-ordered resource. We used to say that the first journo that had the cutting in somebody's file didn't quite control the world, but very nearly did, because everybody plagiarized thereafter, usually without attribution. So if you broke a story or opened a biographical piece, wrote a profile of somebody, and you were the first one in there, you'd find yourself being quoted endlessly and endlessly. I remember I did that accidentally, I think, in the Thatcher years. I quoted somebody wicked in Whitehall, describing a rather sexist way, as Attila the Hen. And this was repeated for about 2 or 3 years in several profiles. It was a fairly heartwarming experience for me and indeed for my informant. Sometimes there were new bits of paper that flowed as the story broke, a white paper, a green paper, a statement, or a press release. White papers in those days were beautifully written, and they were not these sort of shiny, glossy declaratory things. And they were strangers to the language of management consulting in Whitehall of the 70s and 80s. It's a long lost era, filling up with the memory of it, if truth be known. You swiftly added to this new paper trail your own rapidly created oral archive, because you'd get on the phone and chat to contacts. Sometimes you could supplement the fast-growing map in your mind with an interview, either à deux or by asking a question at a press conference. If you were wise, you kept your notebooks and stored them carefully as a kind of hidden treasure. And I couldn't have written my big book on Whitehall in the late 80s if I'd failed to do what my friend Robert Armstrong, the former Cabinet Secretary, calls my squirrel nutkin act, secreting stuff away, which I still do. The result of this scramble could often be divided like gall into 3 parts: a news story, a specialist background piece to supplement the news story and to provide context, and a leading article. All produced within a few hours. I remember vividly the summer afternoon, early afternoon, when William Rees-Mogg, I think it was 1978, my editor, asked me to do my first leader. And if he'd asked me the night before, I wouldn't have slept, because it's a grand thing to do a leader. I was quite young. And he said, have you read Tony Benn's speech to the Conference for the Advancement of British Science in Bath, I think it was, about open government? And it was a good piece from Tony. He said, we don't normally approve of Mr. Benn, do we? But we rather approve of this, don't we? And I said, yes, we do, William. I'd like you to write a leader. I was sort of shocked. How many words? 500 by 530? So I thought, how do I do this? And I remembered the advice Lloyd George had given to Harold Macmillan after his maiden speech. He said, good speech, Macmillan, but it's like a lecture in economics. Too many points, no light and shade. If you're Prime Minister, you can make 3 points. You know, pathos, bathos, light and shade, light it up a bit. Cabinet Minister 2, Backbencher 1. So I thought this is a 2-point story. And then I thought, how would Mr. Gladstone have said it in the House of Commons in 1868, you see? So I put Mr. Gladstone plus Lloyd George plus Macmillan, and it worked. It was one of the great thrills of my life. You can see I've led rather a sheltered life, that I should remember this with such exquisite pleasure. But going back to this sequence on the newspaper, it's all done within a few hours. It was always incomplete and ever risky, but when done well, doing the best with what you had, indispensable as both the first rough draft of history and as a contribution, if it worked well, to the rolling national conversation. And the bricolage of memory was crucial to its being done as best it could. The conversation and mini-interviews that went into such rapid-fire newspaper coverage were to the point and probed the concrete and the here and now. Perhaps more interesting from the perspective of national life stories, an enterprise I deeply admire, were the interviews conducted for longer profiles of individuals in the paper, or the conversations conducted at still greater length for the books of contemporary history. I was, as it were, writing on the side as a journalist. But before moving to these wider, deeper interviews, may I offer a few words on a kind of limbo world between the news story and the profile? It's that strange space occupied by something we Brits do really very well, the obituary. We are top nation when it comes to stiffs. There is no question about that. I can remember the day too in the autumn of 1974 when I was inducted into the craft of the obituary by the Times obituaries editor. 2 things, Peter, he said. The body may still be warm, the widow may still be grieving, but it's the duty of the Times to tell the truth. Very direct, I thought. As for the second, there's always a single sentence that makes a good obituary. Take a look here today at Cyril Connolly's and read out that sentence, and he pointed his finger to it. And it was this sentence, fabulous. Sir Harold Nicholson noted with astonishment his early habit of marking his place in a book at the breakfast table with a strip of bacon. Unforgettable. In every obituary you write, my mentor explained, you need to find an equivalent of Cyril Connolly's strip of bacon. And that's a lesson I've attempted to apply ever since, not just in obituaries, in books too, but with limited success. It's very hard to match that one. Interviews for profiles and books are necessarily shaped to a high degree by prior reading and the print, or now electronic, exhaust that the individuals have left thus far. All too often, there's a kind of agreed view of the man or woman concerned, especially if they've been in the public eye for quite a while. Yet the most accomplished profile drawers of my time, Terry Coleman and Susan Barnes, always managed to add to the particles of prior knowledge. It's as if they were like Heineken Lager and could reach those parts that others could not reach. Their radio equivalent was Anthony Clare's in the Psychiatrist Chair series on Radio 4. Absolutely superb. Coleman, Barnes and Clare's approaches were different, but they shared a common factor. They were not just knowledge-filled, but courteous too. Entirely free of the I name the guilty man or woman syndrome. And their motive power was provided by a combined fuel made up of curiosity and a desire for the interviewee to reflect and explain. And if you're lucky as an interviewer, an element of catharsis can infuse your interlocutor that eases out still more reflection and candour. And of the few occasions in recent years that I've attempted longish interviews on the radio, Coleman, Barnes and Clare have been my guides. I've long thought conversation crucial to journalism and the recording of contemporary history for all the frailties of people's memories and the temptation to portray themselves in as reasonable a light as they think they can get away with. All very human. But reading only last month Dermot McCulloch's fine book Silence, A Christian History, reinforced my belief in the indispensability of such an approach. On the subject of the revelatory power of silence, Dermot was my guide, but his guides were a very potent duo, Arthur Conan Doyle and G.K. Chesterton. To be more precise, Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, Silver Blaze, and Chesterton's Father Brown story, The Oracle of the Dog. And this is how Dermot explained his stimulators. First of all, Conan Doyle's dog that didn't bark in the night. The dog who guarded the stable of the racehorse Silver Blaze did not bark because the midnight visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. It was, in fact, the racehorse's trainer intent on villainy. The dog in the Father Brown story howled because what it thought was the usual stick flung into the sea for it to retrieve was in fact a sword stick, a very heavy sword stick, which sank beneath the waves. A dog, Chesterton wrote, is a devil of a ritualist. He is as particular about the precise routine of a game as a child about the precise repetition of a fairy tale. And the lessons Dermot McCulloch drew from Doyle and Chesterton, I'm quoting him now, like dogs, we are pattern-making animals. The historian's main task is to dig down and to find these patterns, to reconstruct the crystalline structures in the actions and the pronouncements of people, and explain their meaning as far as fragile and pattern-making human beings are capable of doing so. Dermot went on, only when we know the patterns well can we point out what is missing, what should be there but is not. Silence, then, is a vital part of what is missing in history, a necessary tool to help us make sense of the written and visual evidence that we possess. Now, I think probing the silences heretofore, is a key function of the interviewer, and then, if possible, ending the silences, not in pursuit of sensation or prurience, but for the purposes of uncovering the more concealed layers of compost that have gone into a person's making. Documents and memoirs, by definition, don't take you there. Chat can. It's especially important to take your interlocutor into their most formative years, I think, where norms and expectations developed in a particularly vivid, intense or enduring fashion. And it was Napoleon, shrewd chap, bloody nuisance to the Brits, who once said, if you wish to understand a man or woman, think of the world as it was when they were 20 years old. Now, a few years ago, I played this game upon myself. And you might want to do it on the train home, actually. Which are the most formative cluster of years or year for you? And in my case, it turned out not to be when I was 20, but when I was 6 in 1953, coronation year. Come back with me for a moment. Some of you were there too, those 61 years with me. The spectacle of a beautiful young queen alongside a legendary ancient warrior prime minister. Wonderful juxtaposition. Everest was climbed as if on cue by a Commonwealth expedition, a Sherpa and a New Zealander, and the news came in the early hours before that very wet coronation day. And I read the Eagle comic, you see. So I was very keen on the science and technology backdrop to all this, because some of you here will remember, I can see a flicker of a smile on some people's faces, the cutout of the Newark Royal aircraft carrier, the cutout of Calder Hall, which is soon, as indeed it was, to be the first civil nuclear power station to feed electricity into the civil grid. Gatwick Airport, the last word in air travel that was going to solve London's airport problems forever. Oh, bloody contraire. But it's all there, we all cut it out. Beautifully drawn. And we held the airspeed record. Peter Twiss in Fairy Aviation, whatever it was called, coming back to me in a minute. And all of this, you see, fed in a strange way into the old little Hennessy hippocampus then, as a splendid mixture of tradition and modernity, which I thought is what we did. That's what we did, especially. We were very good at that. And I wouldn't have put it like this then, but it gave you a sense for all the rationing that continued and all the bomb sites that were still everywhere and the rather shabby clothes we all wore, that we belonged to a success story nation that could pull off these tricks and sustained a considerable reach and clout in the world, which I still hope for us to do, actually. But we can talk about that, perhaps a discussion. All of it certainly explains, in my generation, the instinct to intervene, as Douglas Hurd put it, and to punch heavier than our weight in the world, another phrase of Douglas's. But Ipsos Mori did a cluster of questions last month, which weren't picked up much in the papers, in many cases not at all, about our place in the world. And for the first time ever, they included the Douglas Hurd phrase, should we try to punch heavier than our weight in the world, given our economic problems and all the rest of it? And the answer was interesting. 52% said yes, 36% said no. So we're still an instinct to intervene people. I'm struck by how many of those 1950s questions, wider ones, political ones, are still making our political weather. Very struck by it. They are, to adapt Michael Frayn again, the graspable continuities of our own times. And this, I think, is the particular fascination of writing about your own times, or it is for me. Our place in the world, we still anguish about this. The We didn't have national security strategies written in those days. We didn't need them. We acquired and lost a huge territorial empire, prevailed with the Allies in 2 world wars, prevailed with the Allies in the Cold War, never had to write it down. Now we have national security strategies, which are a ghastly thing to read. They're a fusion of Blue Peter and management consultees. It's an absolute agony. Except for the last one, when the civil servants, who I've got great sympathy for, were under instruction to make it boring, and my God, they succeeded. There was one sentence only that clung to the Velcro of memory. I haven't written it down because I think it's in there. And it was in the foreword by Nick Clegg and the Prime Minister. And it said, the National Security Council has decided unanimously there'll be no shrinkage in Britain's influence in the world. Well, that's all right then, isn't it? And the very next day, there was a Strategic Defence and Security Review, which took away several of the instruments of our influence in the world. They are funny politicians, aren't they? They really are. Europe was beginning to cause us bothers because of the coal and steel community, you see. The great Jean Monnet had turned up 3 years earlier, without warning, in London, favourite hotel, the Hyde Park, called in his equivalents in London to unveil the coal and steel community. Well, this was like holding a crucifix to Dracula. The reaction was amazing, not for us. And you probably won't succeed, was roughly speaking the summary of the reaction of the Attlee government and the Whitehall of the day. I've always thought it's such a pity we didn't invent Europe, you know, the idea of an integrated Europe, because it would have been very different and we'd have felt it was ours. You see, we did rather like the territorial empire, which was extended family and all that. And we could convince ourselves we invented NATO, because remember General Ismay's private description of what NATO was for. I mean, it's not done to talk about it really, but he said, NATO exists to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, which every Brit understood. It's a completely British way of looking at it. And it worked, didn't it? Nobody can do that for Britain and Europe. But if we'd come up with the idea, you see, the headquarters would have been in an area of high unemployment, quite a small office, perhaps 3 or 4 letters a year, saying, would you mind awfully doing a bit more on free trade? And only if you've got the time, you know. None of this directive stuff or ever closer union. You know? So the emotional deficit with Europe carries on and on and on. And we're in the middle of a revival of it all, which is going to be really quite painful. It does drive us mad, partly because the party system can't handle it, you see, because it busts up parties within. People differ. It's not a left-right thing, which means we can't frame it in the way that we try to. Immigration, not much of a worry then, that's later 50s, but the beginnings of Commonwealth immigration were happening and having an effect on certain areas, and it was talked about. Picture Post had done some really very interesting work on how immigrants were received in the late 40s, and this ran on into the early 50s. The often, in fact, usual faltering performance of the UK economy, which we still feel is fragile despite 3% growth. The Middle East, coup in Egypt, Colonel Nasser, all that, the road to Suez. Russia, Stalin died early in 53, and the succession was all a bit mixed, and there was great hopes. Mr. Churchill clung on to office in the hope of having a meeting at the summit. He in fact coined the word summit in the 1950 election, before the hydrogen bomb did for us all. The US-UK special relationship, great debate about it, very important, very central. Even that notion, that mercurial, elusive, but menacing notion of a British establishment, which I've just written a small book on called Establishment and Meritocracy, had a big revival in 1953 when A.J.P. Taylor revived it in a review in the New Statesman and Nation, as it was still called, of a biography of Cobbett. And the great Cobbett referred to the establishment as the thing. It's really a rather good description for it, the thing. Nobody knows what it is, of course. And Taylor had a wonderful pen. And he recalled Trotsky coming to visit Lenin in London. That must have been a jolly weekend, wasn't it? And Lenin taking him round the sites. Trotsky's not a word that's uttered much in the British Library these days, isn't it? And Lenin said, that's their Westminster Abbey, their Houses of Parliament. In other words, the establishment, you see. And Taylor said ours was the most secure and smuggest establishment in the whole of Europe. And Henry Fairley revived the notion very powerfully 2 years later in his column in The Spectator, when Burgess and Maclean turned up in Moscow and were outed as Soviet agents. And Fairley claimed that people had sort of covered up for them in the intervening years. And it took on a life of its own, this word establishment, which it still does. It's the amazing lightning conductor for those who resent it. It's a very useful piece of catharsis because nobody knows who's in it or what it does. But if people are going to vent and be venomous, it's a good idea to do it on something amorphous that you can't touch, whose people you cannot recognise in the street. So it's a very useful thing. And I think we British are particularly obsessed by notions of establishment. But in 1953, it was a great revival of establishment. All of our current thought patterns, I think, on these matters, the ones I've itemised, and more, are shaped by decades of accumulation on the Velcro of our individual and collective memories. Of course they are. It struck me powerfully, this, in Hogwarts, in the House of Lords, when we debated the Health and Social Care Bill. Now, why did it strike me? Because that bill, now an act, tries to fuse and marry the two great weather systems of post-1945 British politics. The social solidarity, all in it together, free at the point of delivery, Mr. Attlee's settlement, Nye Bevan, all that, with Mrs. T's notion of the market. And it's a very strange statute because almost in successive clauses, and there are many, many of them, these two weather systems jump and punch each other. And it's very difficult to reconcile them. And given the age group, the age range in the House of Lords, the average age is 69.5, we were Mr. Attlee's children, you see, by and large. And so that formation meant that we were all pretty tough on that bill, certain clauses of it. And I suddenly realised that's what it was. Like Martin Luther, we could be no other. The great thing about being in the House of Lords as a historian is you get to have lunch with your exhibits. Because there are at least 6 generations of politicians stockpiled in there, so it's warehoused. And they transmit weapons-grade gossip. Usually with the preamble, I couldn't tell you this 40 years ago, but now I can, you see. And I don't care how old gossip is as long as I get it one day, you see. I'm sort of avid, salivating creature I am. And they're all very nice, as Alf Dubbs, the great Alf Dubbs, said to me shortly after I arrived. You see, we're all on a farewell tour in here. But I digress. Memories are the templates against which subsequent events and developments are judged, as I was mentioning in reliving my time as a youth on the Times newspaper. And the job of those whose profession is the transmission of memory are high up in the list of providers of what the great French social anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu called cultural capital. In fact, to borrow a metaphor from the energy world, our task is cultural capital capture and storage. That's what we do, cultural capital capture and storage. And we're not just there to be storekeepers, but as animators too. We must make memory live and breathe through the interviews. We can do this too by invoking human triggers of sound, not just chat, but music and song. I mean, Perry Como's Magic Moments still causes my knees to wobble a bit and think of 1958. Pathetic, really, but very powerful. What did Noel Coward say? It's extraordinary how potent cheap music can be. Didn't mean to do an impression of Noel Coward this evening, but never mind. Smell. If you're in an area where the Clean Air Act never reached and you get the smell of sulphurous coal smoke on a damp November breeze, it's fabulous. It's back to the 50s. And there are mind-jogging artifacts like enamel bread bins or mangles or ration books from the war and early post-war. There are a lot of those. We must, I think, as historians and interviewers, model ourselves on the old Northern Isles country fiddlers, as described by that great Orcadian poet and writer George Mackay Brown, when he said, each reel and each tale differed in every performance. The tremble of life was in it. Isn't that a wonderful line? The tremble of life was in it. And we mustn't twiddle and vary our stories like the fiddlers, but there must always and everywhere be the tremble of life in them. For archives, or even the most vivid diaries, are never enough. Those of us who've lived a good bit of our lives in the written archives deal essentially with what I would call frozen history. We're cryogenicists. We warm the print and the paper up a bit until it groans and breathes so that we can interrogate it. And what is it that fuels the warmth we cryogenicist historians apply to those cold pages? It's what Albert Einstein called the holy curiosity. Never lose a holy curiosity is what he said. It's the teacher's motto as well, that, or should be, but it's certainly the historians. Or as that brilliant scholar of linguistics, Noam Chomsky, put it during a lecture to the British Academy just last week, the ability to be puzzled is just the beginning of serious inquiry. And once we've applied our puzzlement and our warmth to these documents, then we can go out and talk to the survivors, from those who thought those thoughts and wrote those papers. And declassified material shown to a Whitehall veteran is the best way of getting through that very stout door with the big sign Official Secrets Act nailed to it, because people are by and large very loyal. They keep to their duty, particularly those who are in the Cold War related stuff, intelligence and so on, contingency planning for World War III. And until you can show them these declassified documents with the transition to war exercises and the intelligence assessments, they won't talk. A friend of mine, the former Chief of the Defence Staff, General David Richards, warned in terms of defence and foreign policy pretty recently that we're in danger of living off the fumes of the past. Very interesting phrase. But that's what we historians and creators of oral archives do in a benignly valuable way, because our craft is about vapour. As our friend and inspirer, Penelope Lively, who I'm so delighted to see here this evening, put it in her Ammonites and Leaping Fish, our business is the compelling matter of memory, the vapour trail without which we are undone. May the vapour trail be always with you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you this evening. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, please.
Lord Hennessy, I'm not going to ask a question. I want to say thanks very much for this invitation by National Life Stories and British Library to listen to your presentation. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
You ask very many questions in your lecture. Many questions need many answers. I hope I get the opportunity later to speak to you and sign a book I purchased. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Another one. Silence is not allowed. My dear friend Martin will ask a question, won't you? That's what friendship's for. Will you?
I've had the privilege of listening to you summing up the lives of quite a few of our mutual friends over the years. And I think the one that came most to my mind was last year when you talked about MRD Foote, whom I'm sure many here probably came across one way or another. A man with the most extraordinary reticence on many occasions and an ability to hold forth with great enthusiasm on others. I was just wanting to ask you about, you've probably seen The Imitation Game, which made
Not yet.
Oh, you haven't yet?
No.
Oh, right, okay.
Looking forward to it.
Oh, well, then I perhaps can't refer directly to that. But I thought the thing I learnt from Michael was that all those who'd taken the Official Secrets Act during the war, on the whole, stuck to it pretty loyally for a very long time. Do you think that would happen today?
10,000 people kept the ultra secret. There were 10,000 by the end of the war indoctrinated in it, and they kept it. I think that's almost unimaginable today, isn't it? Well, of course, if it's total war, people think differently. I mean, it really was a remarkably close-run thing, and above all, those people at Bletchley knew what the margins were. Well, other people did. I mean, everybody did. But it is remarkable that 10,000 people kept that secret. And it's still material is coming out from there. And it is the most glorious story. And that has fed into... That has shaped, I think, our little grey cells in terms of expectations, because we are a funny country. We think we can muddle through in a smart muddling through way. It'll be all right because it's us, you know. And one of the reasons we think that, and Bletchley's fed this, is that we're a 59th minute of the 11th hour country. We'll wake up to peril at the last minute, and then something very clever, some cunning plan of Baldrickian proportions will get us through. And Bletchley feeds that, you see, because you put into huts in the South Midlands some of the most amazingly gifted but eccentric people, and they did it. They did it. And they were eccentric. They were gloriously eccentric, a very high proportion of them. And it's a story that speaks to us, you see, of clever people, scholars taken from attics and put in Nissen huts to lick Hitler. And they did it. And they would do it again if they had to. And it's all very powerful within us. So I do think, and that's one of the reasons why Enigma was such a terrific film, and Robert Harris's novel had a big impact. Terrific film, and I've no doubt this one will be as well. And it will speak to us. And whether it speaks to us in a way which I rather hope it does, because I'm not one of those who makes Edward Snowden a hero. He's told some extremely nasty people where it is not safe for them to communicate. And they've stopped communicating in those places. And he's chosen two regimes which do not conform to the norms of Highgate and Hampstead, by which I mean China and Russia, in which to distribute his stuff. So I do hope, I didn't come here to preach, but I do hope that people read across from Bletchley and the necessary need to practice some signals intelligence with safeguards to keep people safe in a nasty world. But I'm not sure that they will, really. But the bit of Bletchley that has really carved into people's collective memory is of this eccentric brilliance up against the odds. And quite right, too. In fact, I was spoofed by a GCHQ friend, I think it was, when I heard about their new building in Cheltenham, which I hadn't visited at that stage, which is a big circular thing, open plan. And I said, is open plan a good idea? I know everybody's cleared up to the eyeballs, but, you know, it's a bit odd. And I said, well, there is one room where there's no window outside or in, because our best young cryptographer can only do his hardest work lying on the floor naked in the fetal position. And of course I fell for this completely, because I wanted to believe it, because that's what Bletchley was like, see. So when I was visiting GCHQ, I said, show me and they said, no, it's not that simple. It's based on the MIT mathematics department. Some of you mathematicians here may know this, called the Cave and the Commons. The Commons is a system of where they sit round with whiteboards and all that. And the caves are the rooms they go into with their own individual whiteboards when they want to do Greta Garbo impressions and be alone. And I said, but why have you got those old-fashioned chalkboards along with the whiteboards? And they said, well, some of them are a bit sensitive and they don't like the smell of the chemicals in the whiteboard markers. So there was a bit of... But I fell for that completely, and it reminded me of all the studies of deception in World War II, which demonstrate mostly that deception works best when you vary just slightly what is known to be so, and you bend it in a direction that people want it to be so. And it works, and it certainly worked on me. Fell for it, hook, line and sinker.
Talking about deception, how do you deal with information that you feel and then you know is wrong? Somebody talks to you and they've made it up. I mean, we encounter this quite a lot in oral history.
Yes.
And we deal with it, we don't deal with it. How do you deal with it?
Well, as a journalist, if you've been a specialist for a while, you tended to know quite a lot. So it would have to be, it would have to fit quite, if they were trying to deceive you, it would have to fit quite closely to what you thought the reality was anyway, that you'd smell a rat. And also, you check, you wouldn't say who you got it from ever. The trick used to be, in the days when it was very tight secrecy in Whitehall, to work out what the distribution list of a particular piece of paper from a cabinet committee was. And you'd go to people in the department that were on the periphery of all this, for whom it wasn't a central concern. And if the Treasury had gone into the hole, they would be more than willing to help you by telling you about it, usually out of Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is a tremendous motive for leaking. Or not leaking, explaining. And you'd work inwards then, that's the way you'd do it. The Civil Service Department was always being got at as well, most unkindly by people, they all leak about that. Or talk to you, because they thought the Civil Service Department, which was there to manage the civil service, was not very good at managing anything. So there was a great deal of Schadenfreude there. And quite a lot of it would come from that. So you would check too. Once or twice I was taken in the early days, but I may well have been taken in on a grand scale and have yet to discover it. Because I have these foibles, as I just confessed a moment ago. We all have versions of that. And It's, I think, in the psychological world, which I don't understand, it's called confirmation bias. If it's something that fits the way you think the world was, or how interesting, and I thought that too, you can be vulnerable with the confirmation bias. So we have to be very careful, all of us. And we must all, to some degree, be taken in. And quite often the person who's saying it has also taken themselves in, either because of mismemory or for other reasons. So it's tricky stuff, isn't it? But it's still indispensable, the interviewing. Absolutely. Yes, John.
Peter, the world's changed very much since you used to take me out for cheap lunches.
He was in the Cabinet Office at the time.
But I wonder, with your historian's hat on, whether you think YouTube should be archived.
Well, I do hope it is somewhere. I'll tell you why. I'm intrinsically a hoarder. If you have got stuff and you can retain it, effectively retain it. But the one book that I wished I could write, but can't now, is related to the electronic world, not just YouTube. And it's a history of the impact of gossip and rumour on high policy making or on politics at Westminster. Because in bad weeks, it's ruled by little else. People are amazingly credulous, as you know. And to do it, I would have had to have started making a weekend note of what had been swirling around pretty well when we first knew each other in the mid-70s, right through to now. Because to recapture it is very difficult. There's other people's diaries, but that's unsatisfactory. And there's private eye, which only does a certain slice of it. And then, it's not quite. So I've always lived in hope that some young journalists, in the position I was in the mid-70s and my late 20s, will set out, a political journalist, to capture, he or she, all that each week, because it's very evanescent. And yet it matters. People will believe almost anything, won't they? For a short period of time, at least. I'm trying to think of some of the best bits of gossip from those days. I did write them down occasionally in the notebooks, all of which I've kept. But of course I made a terrible mistake. I've got an archive at Queen Mary, which the private conversations will not be released. But sometimes, if it was really sensitive, I would just write X and the date. And the problem was, in my desk diary, it also says X and the date, and I can't remember who they were. And quite often, that's where the weapons grade gossip was. Absolutely. Oh, the memories are coming back, John. John was always the incarnation of discretion. Loyal to the end, but good fun over the lunch table, weren't you? I do believe it. Another question.
It relates a bit to what Martin was saying, what Jennifer was saying as well about, and it's to do really with the kind of public narratives that permit memories of a certain kind and encourage silences at other times. I'm thinking of two examples like you. I was born exactly the same year, and my father never spoke about the war, except in very jokey circumstances. And it wasn't until he died, or was very close to the end of his life, that he began to tell me things about the war that he hadn't then. This is just one example. And it seemed, that after the Second World War, there was a kind of silence that was never, that I know of, ordered, but people didn't want to talk about it for all sorts of reasons that you can understand. They wanted to get on with their lives and so on. But it also meant that, experiences of that time would be swallowed, that would then be reclaimed or permitted to be reclaimed later on. And I just wonder whether you have any kind of thoughts on the way those public narratives, never ordered from the top, but somehow kind of swirl in the ether that allows certain things to be mentioned at some times and, conceals them at other times.
It's very interesting that, because it wasn't just Bletchley people, but it was a generation that didn't blab. Also, people were not brought up to show emotion in public, and that means talking about things in a certain way. I mean, it was a bit like that even growing up in the 50s. I mean, if you were, like me, an English male brought up in the 50s, that's embarrassment enough, really. I mean, we're most easily embarrassed people in the world. But if you were brought up a Catholic English boy in the 50s, everything was an occasion of sin. You couldn't talk about most of the things that mattered in life. I mean, only being half serious here, of course. And even now, despite loving a chat and believing in all the oral archiving and all the rest of it, I still feel that reticence. I think our generation, Mary, was the hinge, wasn't it, when we first met at college? All that was beginning to change. But I am still a betweeded figure from the 50s, as you can see, in so many ways. And so we understood that generation that neither blabbed nor flaunted, that took understatement to extremes. Not just silence, but understatement and a kind of modesty. And I thought it was rather wonderful. I also thought it was the norm, because that's our formation. But it's not terribly helpful for historians. I mean, it's a great pity in many ways. But there is a point towards, in the later end of people's lives, when they did start. Many never did. Many never wanted to, for a lot of reasons. It's just not like that today. It's huge social change, isn't it? And I think in many ways for the better, because we were a fairly bottled up nation. We were a sort of magnificent nation post-war, but pretty bottled up. And the nearest thing we could come to showing emotion was laughing at Ealing comedies, you know, which is still a great formative experience for me. No, I didn't come here to confess. What am I doing? Some more questions. Can I see any more hands? Yes, please.
You've talked about being drawn by some kind of common shared narrative history. What about people you've spoken to who you felt actually you would not want to be drawn to? How have you dealt with that? This is a common issue which all historians face. You're interviewing someone whose views you don't share, whose worldview you feel is abhorrent. Is this an experience of yours, and how have you dealt with it?
Yes, not very often, but what you have to do is turn up that curiosity valve. It's because if you want to understand them, you have to have, not empathy, but you have to enable them to explain why it was they felt that way, and to get the force of the feeling, which is very difficult. But journalists are not trained to do this, but you learn to do it. I mean, this isn't people who are abhorrent, but we've all got our own political views of various kinds. And as a political correspondent, which I only did for a little while, much preferring the Whitehall beat, you had to have a kind of empathy with the politician, even if he or she was nowhere near you on the spectrum. Otherwise, you wouldn't understand and be able to report that part of the political scene and its relationship to other bits. And sometimes empathy could be taken for sympathy, and then it became a bit tricky if people thought you were one of them. In fact, maybe I was a bit Puritan about that. I left the Labour Party in 1973, not because I was enraged on a matter of principle, which is always easy to be if you're a Labour Party member, but because I was becoming a political journalist, and I thought it was wrong to belong to a political party if I was going to be a political journalist, and I've never rejoined. It's a great relief in some ways to be in the House of Lords, because I'm not allowed to vote in national elections, you see. I mean, it's a terrible thing to admit. I mean, the sort of agony of choice is no longer there. But I stuck to that in a rather Puritan way, not belonging to any other party. I belong to the Fabians because I like to walk on the wild side, and because there's a clause in the Fabian constitution that enabled you to join, it's for civil servants mainly, to join them without being a party member, as long as you didn't belong to any other party. So I was a, whatever it is, Fabian, fellow travelling Fabian, see. But I thought that was a bit racy, so I gave even that up when I went into the House of Lords to sit on the cross benches. So there are these different pulls, but you have to, it's partly avoiding what Edward Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity. You have to understand people in their own times and their own formations and not shout at them all the time. It's not good if you want to shout at them or argue with them beyond a certain point. But it is a problem, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. One tends to go for one's fellow herbivores, to use Michael Frayn's great distinction between herbivores and carnivores. Well, I'm not entirely herbivorous, but very largely. Yes, another question or two. Yes.
How would you like your work to be remembered in 2 generations' time, and will it be taken as a primary source?
I don't know. What I'd really like is for them to think, well, he had a laugh and he's given us a laugh. Because I do deal with serious stuff, but I like to sort of lard the thing with gossip and jokes. And that's what endures, isn't it? That's what endures. At least you hope it does. Or if anything endures, it's a rather wonderful thing. But I hope... I don't know. Nobody's asked me that question before. It's very interesting. It's slightly alarming. But I suppose it would be nice to have been a part of that generation who wrote the contemporary history as the archives opened up, particularly that Cold War stuff that William Waldegrave, when he was Minister for Open Government, got out for us, having it re-reviewed, the stuff that was held back longer than 30 years because it was so sensitive in the Cold War. And that was really quite exciting because the students did it wonderfully well too, in undergraduate theses, master's theses, PhDs, and to have been part of that group of historians in that period who were the first to work on this stuff, to fill the gaps as best we could in what was a prime piece of catch-up history. Because we all knew there was a secret state in the Cold War, we just didn't know anything about it. And some of the stories are priceless. I think the one story I'd like to be remembered by, I'll just take a sip of water. If this had come out, if I'd been leaked this orally, I wouldn't have believed it. And it's 1960, and the Joint Intelligence Committee alert ministers to the Soviets having low trajectory missiles from eastern Germany that can hit the bomber bases in East Anglia and Lincolnshire in 2 minutes. Not the 4-minute warning, wouldn't be enough. And also the Sovs were putting submarines in the North Sea with missiles that could do the same. So they had to re-engine the V-bombers to get them off in 1.5 minutes from quick reaction alert pads, all that. And then Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was chief of the defence staff, very close to the Americans, thought that a bolt from the Blue Strike would wipe out the British Prime Minister, and the whole command and control system, which depends on the Prime Minister, would be jeopardised. So he suggested that Mr. Macmillan might have an officer with him, like the American president, with the launch codes, you see, follow him everywhere, as still happens, as with the French president, as with Mr. Putin. Now, Macmillan didn't want any fuss, and the Treasury didn't want to spend any money, so they compromised. In each of the 3 Rolls-Royces, such as they were, that carried the Prime Minister, in the spring of 1962, just in time for Cuba, were installed AA phones that the blokes on the bike, do you remember, used to use all that? There were no car phones, then no mobiles. And it's an exchange of letters between the private secretary to the Minister of Works in May 62 and Tim Bligh, who was Macmillan's principal private secretary. Brian Saunders is the Ministry of Works man, because they did the carpool. He says, and I'm doing this from memory, the 3 Rollses are fitted, Pies of Cambridge will service them once a month, and I suggest you test them out every so often. Just a thought, it might be an idea if all the drivers carried 4 pennies with them. Now, the idea, you see, was to get Mr. Macmillan out of the car, alerted by the AA, into a phone box. And as those of you of a certain age remember, you couldn't get it to work without putting 4 pennies in and press button A. So, I would hate to think your driver looking for an agreeable bus conductor in those last 4 minutes of life, is what he said. Exactly what he wrote. Tim Bligh replies, thank you so much for letting me know about the cars. It is true, our drivers in fact do carry 4 pennies, but it is true that sometimes when out motoring one finds oneself penniless. But in such circumstances it is quite easy to use a telephone box, a subscriber trunk dialing system, by dialing 100 and reversing the charges. But of course there's a fallback, because this is Whitehall, isn't there? This office is thinking of taking out membership of the AA, which would give our drivers access to the AA boxes and the RAC boxes all across the country. Now, no other country in the world would have spent all that money on R&D, the H-bombs, the V-force, the airport, the airfields. And this system lasted till the 70s. And if it had been leaked by some traitor to the KGB resident in Kensington, let's call him Colonel Vladimir Nokobolikov, Colonel Nokobolikov would not have believed it, would he? But it was true, and that's the one story I'll be remembered for. Mania is setting in, at least on my part. Have we got time for a couple more, perhaps, if anybody wants? Yes, please. Wait for the microphone.
Your description of being a historian entering the House of Lords reminded me of the end of I, Claudius, where Claudius becomes emperor, and as a historian, he's delighted at being able to access all the secret files. I'm just wondering a little bit, as historian amongst your secret files or exhibits in that sort of way, does that change your earlier perceptions of those same people and situations?
I must say that I've become more sympathetic to the politicians of late, which is odd, really, because everybody's so rude about them. It's a very difficult climate in which they're operating. And also, I pine for the first generation I knew, which was Willie Whitelaw, Dennis Healy. Willie put his finger on it, when he had to leave for health reasons in '88, he gave an interview to the Woman's Own, and my subscription had lapsed, so somebody had to send me a copy. And in it, he said, the difference now in government and politics is not left and right, wet or dry. It's the generational difference between those who'd grown up in the slump and been in the war and those who hadn't. And they were not a perfect generation, but they were very, very grown up. And they had a kind of gyroscopic effect within them. This isn't an argument for a slump and a war. But we live in a world now where we have 3 former special advisors as party leaders. Now, special advisors are a good thing. But there's a problem with the political class as it's developing, is they've not done anything else between student politics and being in the cabinet but politics. It's very narrowing. And the problems they have to deal with are immense and overlapping. And I don't think it's me gilding that Whitelaw-Healy generation. They were very special. And it's just a difference in formation. And also the cult of the youth is a bit of a problem, for me, in politics. I never believed in the cult of the youth, even when I was one. And now gerontocracy seems to be an increasingly attractive form of government, but that's being flippant. But I have become more sympathetic to the politicians. And I do regret the miasma in which they live of venom directed in their direction as a breed. It's very interesting because the opinion polls suggest, the surveys, that people by and large are very nice about their own MPs, but they don't like the breed. And it's this scapegoating on a breed as a whole. They're absolutely indispensable, as is Parliament. The only people who show the respect due to Westminster Parliament these days are the Russian intelligence service in London. They have 2 officers assigned to penetrating it. Isn't that interesting? They take it seriously, even if nobody else does. And if they're here this evening, good evening. Last one from my friend at the back.
Peter, in your room at Queen Mary's, you've got a picture of Clement Attlee on the wall. Yes. And I know it's a big question, but why your, I use the term loosely, your love affair with Clement Attlee, and what would he make of 21st century politics in Britain?
Well, I'm deeply old-fashioned, really. This is a ludicrous thing to say, but he didn't want to be Labour Party leader. He became it by accident. So he's an accidental Prime Minister, and he turned up trumps. And he had a very high sense of old-fashioned duty. He had no sense of personal vanity, and he's also terribly funny. And I was speculating the other day, in a talk I was doing, of if we'd had these leadership debates, as we had before the last general election in 1950, what would it have been like? You see, the first question would have produced a 20-minute soliloquy from Churchill, a grand tour d'horizon, rolling phrases. And then the mediator would have said, Mr. Attlee, and he would have said, quite, and put his pipe back in it. And I find that deeply appealing. As Douglas Jay, who worked with him, said, Clem Attlee would never use one syllable where none would do. And I think he was wholly admirable and ran that cabinet wonderfully well and could be very, very funny. And also, I tell you when I really began to admire him, I can't remember the words exactly, but Granada did a long television interview with him in the last year of his life, and I've got the transcript. And the interviewer gets increasingly desperate, as interviewers tended to do with Attlee, because of the questions in the text are this long and the answers are like that. Mr. Attlee, on the 26th of July 1945, when you realised Labour had won the election, did you feel a sense of destiny as you went to the palace to kiss hands in the way that Mr. Churchill had felt the sense of destiny walking with him in May 1940? No, never had any sense of personal destiny. But surely, Mr. Attlee, you must... No. And I think that is just wonderful, because I have an aversion to destiny politicians who inhale their own careers. It always ends in tears, and they are entirely free of self-irony. So for me, he is the gold standard Prime Minister. Absolutely. But it's a long time ago since I first fell in love with him, and I did. I thought this was terrific. But of course, he wouldn't get selected for a losable seat now, let alone a winnable one, because his television, he and Clem were not made for each other, were they? And just imagine the drizzle of bollocks that you had to listen to when you were in your constituency, listening to would-be candidates, you know. All the well-rehearsed spontaneities, the curse of Blue Peter and all this stuff. I mean, just imagine Clem going before a selectorate today, or running for London Mayor. More's the pity. More's the pity. You've touched a raw nerve there. A benign raw nerve. Thank you very much.